Join us at the UnHerd Club at 7 p.m. on the 10th of November for an exclusive masterclass with philosopher Nina Power on the subject of the late great Alasdair MacIntyre, the Scottish-American moral philosopher who sadly died this year but leaves an enormous legacy in his wake. If you want to find out more about MacIntyre and his big ideas and exactly how they could be applied to the world as it stands, then join us. Go to unherd.com/live and you'll be able to see the whole thing as it happens. If you don't subscribe, you'll only get the first 15-minute preview and then you'll be cut off. So go to unherd.com/live now and become a subscriber and you can watch the whole thing as it runs. Gentlemen, welcome back to the UnHerd Club. If this is your first time with us, then a very special welcome to you, and to all of you who come regularly. It's lovely to see your gorgeous faces here on this fine evening. Last week, we were sat in this very room speaking to James Orr and Graham Tomlin about Pascal and Descartes, asking the question, where did the Enlightenment go wrong? Which begs the question, has UnHerd really got it in for the Enlightenment? I think I'm going to have to come up with some pro-Enlightenment content pretty fast, or I'm going to face the same kind of fate as the BBC. But tonight we're here to talk about another enemy of Enlightenment thinking, Alasdair MacIntyre, a theorist of moral decline who argued that contemporary ethics had been cut off from its roots, largely thanks to that aforementioned Enlightenment. He was born in Glasgow in 1929 and was occasionally contradictory, often infuriating to his colleagues and comrades alike. He was an avowed Marxist who sneered at student protests as the trifling of those with no real practical injustices to fight against, a killer of sacred cows. So, our kind of man. Terry Eagleton wrote just after his death in UnHerd, he was one of the great moral philosophers of the 20th century. He was a radical Scottish Puritan, austere and high-minded, who ended up supporting the revival of monasticism and switched his sympathies from the Bolsheviks to St. Benedict. His dissent from the priorities of the modern age took an incongruous variety of forms, but remained wholly self-consistent. After tearing up all of his previous works, he wrote his most famous book, After Virtue, in 1981, his best-known work in his lifetime, and he died earlier this year at the age of 96. He left behind him, of course, an extraordinary prescience, a legacy of some renown in the philosophical world, but one that, as I hope we will discover this evening, goes far beyond those who know his name. He was, in many ways, the pugnacious godfather of post-liberalism, and who better to talk to us about him tonight than the pugnacious godmother of post-liberalism.
What is that?
A similarly provocative character, no. Nina Power, the philosopher and writer, a regular here at UnHerd. You've probably seen her on the stage before, and the author of What Do Men Want? Please welcome her to the UnHerd Club. Thank you. Okay, so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk for about 40 minutes about Alasdair MacIntyre. I will confess I knew very little about him before his death, and Nina can tell us all why he is still so relevant today. And then we will turn over to all of you lovely people for your thoughts, comments, questions. For once, I'm not going to be the kind of draconian dominatrix that I usually am and berate you about whether something is a question or not. You are actually open in this environment to make comment. So please think about what you would like to say in the second half. We'll take a short break in the middle so you can lubricate yourselves in the bar, and then we'll come back. If you're watching online, you will only get the first 15 minutes of this free preview of this event, and then you'll have to subscribe. Go to unherd.com/live, become a subscriber, join our free-thinking family. Alasdair MacIntyre would surely approve. So, Nina, let's start off with the obvious question. Why is it that where so many philosophers, their ideas and frameworks fade very quickly after their death, why is it that MacIntyre still rings so true to so many?
I think because the level at which he was thinking about the problems of liberalism have only become more apparent. And some of what he was discussing in After Virtue, and we'll get to some of the questions about what virtue ethics is and so on. His diagnoses in this book are extremely relevant for the current crisis of liberalism, which I think a lot of people have recognised, at least in part. And I know you might want to defend some aspects of liberalism. We might want to do this as well. And so figures like John Gray have sort of recently put a flag in the sand and said, like, no, I'm not a post-liberal. Actually, we are liberal subjects and we are individualistic, and especially in the Anglosphere. But I think what Alasdair MacIntyre was trying to do, I mean, he begins the book by making an analogy, like imagine if the scientific tradition, he takes this from a novel actually called Canticle for Leibowitz, but imagine if everything we knew about science had been destroyed in some situation and we had to piece together all the fragments of our entire sort of corpus of knowledge, and he says that's what our moral thinking is, that we've inherited. There's been a sort of series of massive breaks in our understanding of ourselves, and in order to even begin to think about who we are, what the good life might be, what kind of creature we are, and so on, we have to understand the destruction that has been wrought upon our moral concepts. And to give you an example of how he describes this, and I think you'll all recognise this, when people, and we all do this, engage in kind of moral discussion, right, whether what we think is right and what we think is wrong, these conversations often are interminable. They often result in no conclusion. They often result in people getting very angry with one another because people have very strong feelings about what it is that they believe, right, on all kinds of topics. We can think about this, everything from abortion to education to marriage to sexual morality and so on, right? We're surrounded by claims, people making, expressing opinions, if you like, about what those things ought to be and how we should collectively live. And Alasdair MacIntyre just sort of describes this as emotivism. So basically, through the entire destruction of the history of moral thought, most particularly an idea of thinking about virtue, and virtue is not a concept that we associate with modernity particularly, we've ended up in a situation where we take our moral feelings to be, and our preferences and our desires, to be individual truths, and we're sort of smashing up against each other constantly because we haven't understood the conceptual world in which we are founding our positions, right? So we end up with just a series of endless kind of conflicts, right? So some people might be coming from one moral position, some people from another. People might not even understand what their moral position is ultimately. So MacIntyre is saying that we need to get back down into the history of moral thought and the way in which it has sort of wended its way through all kinds of situations, including and especially the Enlightenment, where indeed he says the Enlightenment understanding of moral autonomy has ripped that concept out of its communal, collective, human understanding, if you like. And so we're ending up with all of these different moral claims and no understanding of any foundation upon which we're making them. And some people might celebrate this. This is, postmodern pluralism, everyone can make up their own mind, we're all individuals and so on and so forth. But MacIntyre is very interested in how we got to that place. So I think one of the reasons, he is very, very important, but he was also quite sidelined in the academy as well. I mean, he was a professor at Notre Dame and many other places, but he was also kind of strangely out of time and not really part of any movement, if you see what I mean. He's a very singular figure, partly because he's an Aristotelian, we'll get to that, partly because he's a virtue ethicist, partly because he then becomes a Catholic, and he's also a kind of Thomist, so he's very interested in Aquinas, and he thinks you can, sort of supplement Aristotle with Aquinas, and partly because the things that he is calling for are very marginal from the standpoint of a liberal position. I mean, at one point he says of liberalism, he says, ever since I understood liberalism, I have wanted nothing to do with it. And he said he felt this as a Marxist and then as a kind of Catholic. He was also very resistant to being pinned down as left-wing or right-wing. So he refused in many ways to be pulled in either direction. I think this is partly because he's a philosopher rather than a political thinker, although his thought does have potentially political implications. But I think it's also because that sort of left-right distinction is also what liberalism is, if you see what I mean. And actually there are deeper questions about who we are, the kind of creature that we are. What does it mean to be human, right? And he gets further and further into this question, what we might call metaphysical biology, which he initially is suspicious of. But in the first place, he's in After Virtue, so from the early 80s, he's trying to piece together the history of the destruction of moral philosophy. Like, how did we get to this point of thinking that how we feel is the most important thing, and the fact that we can't ever reach consensus, we think of ourselves as individuals, and actually this is a crisis. You know, this is not an achievement. This is not a great modern brilliant thing. This is actually the consequence of a series of destructions and forgetting.
So let's dig down into the actual kind of philosophy that comes before him that he calls upon. He makes this distinction between, as you say, the Aristotelian kind of telos and versus the kind of Nietzschean atomization. What's he calling on there? What references does MacIntyre take to kind of support this idea of the loss of this telos-based virtue ethics and the kind of destruction of what he sees to come?
Sure. So, I mean, if we're thinking about telos, this is like, what is a thing for? And take the concept of the good. If we think that the good is nothing other than what I personally think, and then we all disagree about what the good is, then we've already assumed that there is no underlying shared conception of the good. So MacIntyre will go back to Aristotle and particular periods, and he's a great historical thinker. I should be clear about this. He says that basically we're fundamentally narrative creatures. Actually, you know, we're not fragmented. We come from a long line of history. We're embedded. We're contextual, and that our moral stories and even the moral philosophies themselves, even or especially when they make claims to universality or to being ahistorical, are in fact historical products. They're historically situated. All the philosophers, of course, are themselves the products of a long series of inherited stories about who we are and so on and so forth. So he wants to re-embed thought in its collective production and not to pretend that it's something like a kind of objective science or something like that. He says we're fundamentally narrative. And I suppose teleology would be something like saying, as I said, like, what is something for, right? And he makes this point about what he calls a functional concept. So when we say of something, it is a good X, right? Like if a watch is broken, it is not a good watch, or the watch is not fulfilling its function. And he says, well, we can also do this about roles. So we could say, well, this person is a better or worse father, right? We can make these kinds of judgments. But this presupposes that we understand what a father is and what it means to be a better or worse father. So what it means to be a good father. And in modernity, that kind of severing of, say, what the purpose of something, and even the idea that we can make those kinds of judgments. You know, there's something very unfashionable about saying, oh, we can say that someone is a better or worse version of X. You know,
even you just saying about the father makes me think of like Winnicott's kind of good enough parent, and the idea that actually we've converted through kind of child psychology and psychologizing of everything into something that says there is this enormous spectrum upon which you will never be kind of finally judged, that you could kind of edge towards goodness rather than actually being defined as either good or bad, that there would never be a moment that said you are always on a spectrum, you'll never be good or bad, which is also quite, it feels then like proto-religious as well. We'll get into, I suppose, his Catholicism and what's going on there. But I mean, he had some particular thoughts on science and the way in which the scientific institution was bound up in this kind of like the breakdown, post-Enlightenment breakdown of the ideas of virtues or fundamental ethics. And given the last decade, the COVID lockdowns and everything that we've all been through as a kind of society, it feels like, I don't know, we would need him more than ever in this moment to talk about the fundamental virtues. And I was speaking to you earlier about the BBC, the virtues that the BBC was grounded in, and the way in which that has obviously come apart in recent days.
Sure, and I think one of the most important distinctions he makes is between what he calls practices on the one hand and institutions on the other. So practices are, let's say, take chess. He uses chess as an example, or learning to play the piano. There are what he describes as goods internal to the practice, right? So if we get better at playing the piano, this is not really necessarily for anything in the sense that it's functional or it produces anything, right? But there is a virtue involved in learning to be better at something, right? Such that we could then say, well, this is a very accomplished pianist or a very accomplished chess player and so on. And he sort of thinks that if instead we have a kind of purely utilitarian or based idea, well, it's just what does it do for us, or what does it produce, what does it make, that we've actually detached the practice into something kind of measurable, which is kind of quasi-scientific, right? And the institution, on the other hand, as opposed to the practice, invariably go wrong. I mean, Ivan Illich makes this point as well, that they start to produce people. I mean, he's also very extremely critical of the bureaucratic impulse, also of the therapeutic impulse. These are two things which absolutely dominate our world, right? He's completely right about this. You know, he talks about these kind of figures, these characters, the therapist and the bureaucrat. These are like institutional creatures, right? And these are very detached from any ideas, as he would say, of a kind of human good or the common good. And a lot of people have been talking lately, whether you're red Tory or blue Labour or any kind of post-liberal, about the common good. You know, and this is something that liberal individualism, with its obsession with autonomy, just dispenses with. You know, that we seem to have forgotten that not only are we part of a community and we inherit stories, however fractured and broken those are, in the name of some fantasy of the individual. And I think it's this sort of critique of individualism that many people have responded to, among other things.
I mean, he writes a bit about fishing villages and the kind of small utopias that used to exist in places like where he grew up in Scotland, and where there were tiny communities who had what he believes to be a genuine sense of the common good. In MacIntyre's kind of envisioning of the world as it is there any way of returning to that kind of more village-like common good way of living, or actually are we too fractured, are we too postmodern? Is there no way back?
I mean, I think John Gray would say it's too late, that we are inevitably pluralistic, and, you know, recently he was calling for more kind of a Hobbesian, we just need a stronger state, you know, to manage pluralism. But I think people have criticised MacIntyre for the idea that these ideas of community are too fringe, if you like, they're too small, like they're not scalable. But then you might want to say, well, liberalism isn't scalable either, actually. You know, we may have reached the buffers in terms of, like, taking the individual as far as it could possibly go, for example. You know, why do people feel such a deep sense of alienation? Why do people actually long for community, however postmodern? Like, what does it mean to kind of reinvent community? So that would go to the deeper question of the kind of creature that we are, qua human, right? Which is a very philosophical question, and would concern, if you like, tracing, again, back to the question of teleology. You know, when we say something is something, and then we say, what is it for? And then we say, well, we can have better or worse versions of that. We are making judgments about better and worse ways of living. You know, and I think we can say that there are clearly better and worse ways of living, right?
I think his own journey as well seems like a journey that mirrors the journey I've seen many people go on, which is that of the kind of Marxist agitator and activist who feels very strongly that they have the kind of the reason behind doing anything is because of the good of the common person, to this kind of journey towards Catholicism and the belief in a kind of one true goodness with a capital G. And I guess I would just be interested to know how you see him as like an figure of that journey that we, at least in this room, often see amongst people we know who end up here because they have come from being left-wing activists and then find themselves in this kind of strange space where they still feel a kinship to those initial Marxist values, but then also have this real fear of a lack of community, a lack of utopian thinking, a nihilism, a Nietzscheanism that's happened on the left.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the first place we would have to say for MacIntyre, ideas have material consequences, right? So the ideas we inherited are not arbitrary, they're not contingent, they come out of a whole history of stories, and that abstractions are very powerful, right? I think, so when we get obsessed with justice, for example, like, and young people are, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? The idea that the world is unjust and we must remake it and we must seek kind of more justice for more people and so on. MacIntyre would say, right, you've inherited a certain way of understanding these things, much of which actually comes from Christianity, which we have forgotten. Tom Holland makes a version of this point, and many people have started to make this point publicly. I think there's now popular understanding that the liberal and secular ideas of human rights, for example, the values implicit in some of those positions, actually really do stem from a long history of Christianity, even where people are saying, oh no, but I'm an atheist and I came up with this myself and so on.
Well, that's also one of his points, isn't it? Is you can say that you don't believe something, but you might not realise why you believe it.
Sure, and that we all have inherited these virtues and these values, however much we sort of might want to distance ourselves from them or pretend that we're doing something new. You know, they're actually deeply embedded. So ideas have consequences, but they are always materially instantiated. And so, how do I put it? Abstractions themselves are material realities, and they're very powerful, right? So instead of, I mean, a kind of more materialist understanding of history would point to economic changes, technological shifts, and so on and so forth, right? You can understand history in that way as a sort of, and the ideas would be kind of epiphenomena of these deeper processes, right? But actually, in some ways, it's the other way around, right? It's when you have different abstractions that are very powerful that then work themselves out through society and through practices and through behaviours. They're always in motion. Do you see what I mean? You know, and some pass in and out of being fashionable, as we've seen. You know, the last 10 years is a great lesson in how fashionable ideas are very powerful. You know, that they filter into the institutions. They then are enacted or performed in those institutions by people sort of enforcing them, however crazy they are.
But this is like a zeitgeist.
Yeah.
Surely there is like something here about, you know, that there is something ineffable but very real about the ideas that underlie all of society and all of time, and that actually just kind of spring up occasionally.
Yeah, for sure. But underlying that, philosophically, we might want to say, well, what is it actually that is in continuity, right? What is it that what can we say about human beings? And this is the tension with the kind of potentially historicist account in which you're saying, oh, well, look, these ideas come out of this specific context and they're a story that makes sense for these people in this community, and they're part of a practice and a series of rituals and so on. How then can we get underneath that and say, what is it that actually makes us the kind of creatures for whom those stories make sense, right? So fundamentally, MacIntyre would want to say we are storytelling creatures, and we are the types of people for whom narrative is very important. But much of the time in modernity, we've cut ourselves off. We're cut off from precisely those contextual stories. So that our practices no longer make sense, if you like. And he gives the example of, I think it's like Polynesian natives who Captain Cook goes and sees them, and he asks them why they're doing particular things, and they say, well, we don't know anymore. We just do them.
They have
right?
taboos that they can't say what those taboos actually are,
right,
or why they're taboo.
Exactly. So a culture or civilization that no longer knows why it does the things it does has been cut off from its purposes, right? Like it's forgotten what those rituals are for. You know, we just keep doing them because we always do them.
The process of forgetting seems to have accelerated quite significantly. Like if you think about those Polynesians, that is because it's the work of like many generations in which people inherit ideas of what a taboo is, and they just learn them as this is wrong, this is right, and we don't know quite why, but that's fine. It feels that in the last 25 years or so that there has been this extreme acceleration. Of course, the internet has a part to play in it, in the way in which these, I don't know, like you could call them mass delusions of morality have happened. The cycles have happened so much quicker. Was MacIntyre writing at any time in the, recently? Did he have any response to the way in which this has changed and the kind of culture that we're now in? Or what do you think he would have thought of the way we are?
I mean, not particularly. I mean, he did sort of refuse to pick sides in political battles, as I said. And whilst people on the right, for example, because of this interest also in natural law and Catholicism and J.D. Vance and Rod Dreher and Milbank, and there's a lot of people who saw a lot in MacIntyre and took him in a particular direction, and he was never particularly comfortable with that. He did not want to be the kind of, I think Nathan Pinkowski makes this point in his kind of obituary, that in a way MacIntyre also kind of almost disavowed those children, right? Because he was being accused of being a reactionary in the academy already. And I don't think he saw himself in any way as a conservative, actually. He describes himself as a revolutionary Aristotelian, which is paradoxical, right? But I think he always held out hope for, let's say, tiny but kind of self-organizing communities, although he also said he wasn't a communitarian, and of course he wasn't a Marxist, and of course he was a Catholic. And in many ways, later on, when he starts talking about dependent rational animals, which is his attempt to revisit some of the Aristotle he left behind, right? So earlier on, he does talk about virtues. He talks about the common good and the kind of Greek approach, and contrasts it with modernity. Later on, he realizes that actually he's thrown away some of Aristotle that he actually needs to deal with, which is the metaphysical biology, which is to say, what does actually follow from the kind of creatures that we are, right? And he decides that we are dependent rational animals, right? Which is to say that we are dependent upon each other. We're very vulnerable. And many care ethicists and feminists actually saw an ally in MacIntyre, although they didn't like the Catholicism because they were opposed to the church.
Seems like everyone can see an ally and an enemy in MacIntyre.
Exactly. Rational because we have the use of reason, and that this is actually how we are also able to do politics. Of course, he thinks that politics in practice has been cut off from these questions of the common good and these deeper philosophical questions of what it is to live a good life. And it's become a functional, really quite evil bureaucratic thing in many ways. And he refused to vote, as far as I understand it, or at least he said, I'm not going to vote for either side when people asked him about that. And animals, this is interesting. So he tries to make this argument that we actually, our intelligence and the kind of creature we are also like dolphins and so on, and that we shouldn't think of ourselves as completely separated from the animal world, which again puts him in slight tension with, I suppose, a certain Christianity, which might see human beings as uniquely endowed with souls, for example, or uniquely given the gift of the capacity of intelligence and so on. So again, he's also in slight conflict with his Catholic
and also
allies.
Runs the risk, I suppose, then at that point of becoming a kind of ecologist, of being someone who says that it's our moral duty rather than to kind of have ownership over nature, to like respect the lineage, like the lineage we have with our own past, our history, the stories we've told, with our connection with animals and with nature.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see a continuity with this idea of embeddedness, the fact that we are in a place, that we are in a world, and not that isn't just human, right? And in fact,
no, but like some Christians would say, you have husbandry, that like you can decide to look after or to use,
right,
as
but there is
you
a real material reality to that underlying world, if you see what I mean, like the creation upon which we depend, right, to live and to farm and to eat and so on and so forth. So I think in that sense you could see it's an expansion of his contextualizing of the fact that all human ideas in life is lived in practice. That he thinks that, for example, academic philosophy, academic moral philosophy, particularly the analytic variety, is completely detached from the real world and the way in which people actually live their lives, right? That it's ended up in this kind of hermetic circle talking to itself. And that it's been, and that its abstraction, its abstract concepts have indeed reinforced its own abstract nature. Because those concepts have become disembedded from practice and
so
from...
We live with the kind of shadows of previous moral frameworks that have since died, and then we have to kind of live with the echoes of them, but they don't mean anything anymore. That feels very true of like post-2020 world, if that makes sense, kind of post-summer of 2020, post-COVID, that we all still live with the remnants, you know, literal kind of COVID masks or abstract like language around kind of DEI and whatever that seems to have really gone out of fashion now, but we still live with all of the kind of relics of that time.
Yes, so I think it's like this enormous pile of fragments, none of which cohere, basically. You know, that's what our moral inheritance looks like, at least in his diagnosis in the first book, in the first key book, I should say, in After Virtue, because we can't piece them back together. They don't seem to fit with one another. He says that moral discussions become increasingly shrill, which I think is, we are very familiar with that shrillness. You know, people are gripped with a thought of injustice, of what the good thing is, but it is detached from any foundational reality.
I mean, does this actually maybe allow us an opportunity to be more charitable towards the shrill? Because if you say that the shrillness is downstream of effectively trying to use what you think is the language of the moral framework you've been given, you've inherited, and realizing that when you use that language, that somebody comes back with a kind of blank stare, that there is not the same recognition because it's not grounded in a kind of shared moral virtue, that actually that could cause people to enter into a kind of paranoid hysteria, that they are so misunderstood or speaking into the void that you know, it seems unsurprising that people would become shrill in that atmosphere.
No, completely. And I think he's not condemning, I suppose, if you like, the people who are behaving like that, because they are, in a way, a symptom of this, indeed, this kind of fractured moral history, because it's been destroyed, you know. And so it's not really a surprise, in a way, that that's what's going on. And to the extent that you get people saying no debate, you know, I'm not going to talk to you about this at all because I just think you're evil and wrong.
MacIntyre was fascinated by his own heritage and the way at which it kind of shaped him. He grew up, did he speak Irish when he was a child? Yes, so he kind of had this extraordinary upbringing and then moved down into London for kind of his school years, and then of course ended up in America where he was part of the Catholic Church there. But yeah, could you tell us a bit more about kind of how his own personal identity formed him? Because almost every obituary I read of his said that unlike kind of most of his companions in moral philosophy, he was unusual in being very placed and feeling a strong connection with his early years and his familial background and the way in which that had shaped his philosophical ideas.
Sure, and I think he was very loyal to that, right? Like as you say, he never forgot the stories and that kind of community, even though he was also deracinated, even though he was nomadic, even though he was a liberal subject like all of us. I think because he saw the goods internal to those practices, right? What does it mean to sit around and share stories that have been passed down, or to play music together, all of those sorts of things? You know, they don't have a sort of spreadsheet meaning, right, in a kind of bureaucratic world. There's something else. And I think that another symptom would be precisely like individuals clamoring for a need to belong, as you say. Like people are desperately seeking community, even when people are trying to sort of also be special by claiming a particular identity or whatever. They then seek out a community of other people who are doing the same thing, right? Which would indicate that there are hard limits to individualism, like that we're not fundamentally individual in some screaming into the void sense.
Do you think this might be also why he himself was attracted to Marxist or later Trotskyist groups and then into the Catholic Church? Is it actually kind of a sense of belonging that brings him to those places that he's looking for?
Yeah, for sure. But I think it's because of the deep philosophical as well as personal embrace of these underlying questions of virtue, for example. Like, it is possible to think about the virtues. Why those specific virtues? Why have we might have forgotten them. We might think that virtue is silly or whatever. Like, what does it mean to even be virtuous? Don't we just do what we like and hope that it doesn't hurt too many people?
Well, we've replaced virtues with values, haven't we? So there is this kind of new thing, which I think people think is the same as virtues, which is like, what are British values?
Right.
And then they say, like, fair play, rule of law. You get your classic British values, like love's a cup of tea, sense of humour, ha ha ha.
No, and it's interesting, aren't they? Because these are thinly veiled references to practices.
Yes.
Right? So having a cup of tea is a practice. But, I mean, the difference between values in that sense and virtues have to be practiced. Virtues are not just something you say. I'm a humble person, she said, bragging. It's like...
Well, every Hollywood star who gets an Oscar says, I'm enormously humbled by this moment, and I'm always like absolutely seething with rage at their misuse of that in its obvious decontextualized version.
Right. So virtues as a set of practices, virtue is its own rewards. We might say. I'm sure people's grandparents used to say that. But the goods internal to the practice of being virtuous are not simply statements in that sense, right? They're not value statements in that shallow sense, right? They have to be performed in context.
What are the virtues?
With others.
What are the virtues that he kind of lands on or feels are especially important?
Well, I think that's complicated. I mean, he talks about the heroic age, and we're very much past the heroic age. The idea of, I mean, if you watch Stanley Kubrick's film, I always forget, Barry Lyndon, where we have a depiction of a very different age that has extremely different virtues. And this is one of the complexities of MacIntyre, because one thing that could happen is you could say, well, isn't this relativistic, right? You're talking about all these different historical periods and the way in which different ideas come out of different contexts. How can we then decide which one is best or something like that? Was the heroic age better than the liberal age? We might want to say, yeah, in many ways, it was great. But, there were also downsides, right? So he's forced back, I think, into this question, right, to avoid historicism, the idea that there are just competing different historical narratives. He has to kind of talk about what underlies those, and if he plumps for Aristotelianism and Thomism, it's because he thinks those ways of seeing and thinking are the most true, clearly, right? If he's a Catholic, it's because he thinks Catholicism is the right, faith, if you like. But even underlying those, he wants to say something like Aristotelianism and natural law and asking questions about the kind of creature that we are. Things go wrong after that. There's a sort of infamous separation in philosophy between the is and the ought, right? The idea that if you say something is something, that you can't say what it's for, that there is no way you can then say it should be like this, right? Just because something is...
If you're seeing my face, I'm afraid that means that it's the end of your 15-minute free preview. If you want to watch the rest of this live event with Nina Power on the subject of Alasdair MacIntyre, and I'm sure you probably do if you've watched that first 15 minutes, then all you have to do is go to unherd.com/live and subscribe. Then you can pick up where you left off, plus you'll get everything else UnHerd has to offer. That's long-form journalism, videos, podcasts, you name it, we've got it. Go to unherd.com/live. What are you waiting for? If you want to continue watching this exclusive masterclass on Alasdair MacIntyre with the wonderful one and only Nina Power, then you need to go to unherd.com/live and become a subscriber. And if you haven't already become one, then what are you waiting for? There's so much on offer. You'll not only get the rest of this exclusive live event, all of our future live streams beamed into your inbox for free, but also everything else UnHerd has to offer. That's long-form journalism of the highest caliber. Video, essays, podcasts, interviews, you name it, we've got it here at UnHerd. Just go to unherd.com/live and become a member of our free thinking family. You won't regret it.